All right, here we go with section 6. And here's the focus question. Reagan's path to the presidency was unusual. Originally a New Deal Democrat and head of the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan became the spokesman for General Electric in the 1950s, preaching the virtues of unregulated capitalism. His nominating speech for Barry Goldwater at the 1964 Republican Convention brought him national renown. In 1966, he was elected California's governor, and in 1976, he challenged Ford for the Republican nomination, almost winning it. His victory in the 1980 election brought together old and new conservatives, Sunbelt suburbanites and urban working class ethnics, anti government crusaders and aggressive cold warriors, and libertarians and the Christian right. Although Reagan, the oldest man ever to serve as president to that point, was often underestimated by his opponents, he was politically experienced and a gifted public speaker whose optimism and good humor appealed to many Americans. Reagan made conservatism seem progressive, and he reiterated themes of America's mission to be an example of freedom in the world that had their origins in the American Revolution. Reagan seized the terms of the debate and put Democrats on the defensive. While Reagan, like his predecessors, invoked economic freedom, he defined it as reducing union power, dismantling regulations, and radically reducing taxes. In 1981 and 1986, Reagan won tax reforms from Congress that dramatically reduced taxes for the wealthy and moved America away from the idea of progressive graduated income taxes. Reagan also appointed conservatives to lead regulatory agencies that reduced environmental and workplace safety opposed by business. Liberals, since the New Deal, had tried to fuel economic growth by using government power to raise Americans' purchasing power. Reagan, using supply-side economics, called trickle-down economics by opponents, relied on high interest rates to curb inflation and lower tax rates for businesses and the wealthy to stimulate private investment. This policy assumed that cutting taxes would make Americans at all income levels work harder because they would keep more of what they earned and that everyone would benefit from increased business profits in a growing economy, which would raise government revenues despite lower tax rates. Reagan also began an era of hostility between government and labor unions. In 1981, when members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers organization, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, went on strike in defiance of federal law, Reagan fired them all and used the military to supervise air traffic until new controllers were trained. Reagan inspired many employers to launch anti-union offensives, and more businesses now hired workers to permanently replace those who had gone on strike. Manufacturing employment continued its long-term decline, further reducing union strength. When Reagan left office, both the service and retail sectors employed more Americans than manufacturing, and only 11% of non-government workers were union members. Reaganomics, as critics called the administration's policies, initially created the most severe recession since the 1930s. But a long period of economic expansion followed the recession of 1981 and 1982. As employers reduced their workforces, shifted productions overseas, and used new technologies that became more profitable. Simultaneously, inflation dropped dramatically, in part because of greater oil production. The stock market rose and, despite a sharp drop in 1987, continued to climb. Reagan's policies, deindustrialization, and rising stock prices contributed to increasing economic inequality. By the mid-1990s, the richest 1% of Americans owned 40% of America's wealth, twice their share of 20 years earlier. Most spent their income not on productive investments in charity, as supply-side economists predicted, but on luxury goods, real estate speculation, and corporate buyouts that often led to plant closings. Middle-class income stagnated, especially for families with stay-at-home wives, while the income of the poorest declined. With less investment in public housing, the release of mental patients from state hospitals, and cuts to welfare, more and more Americans became homeless. Deindustrialization and the decline of unions particularly devastated minority workers who only recently had won skilled work in union jobs. While affirmative action expanded the black middle class by offering more educational opportunities, black workers suffered. Though Jim Crow had ended in many workplaces in the 1970s, black workers lost their jobs as manufacturing declined. By 1981, the black unemployment rate was higher than 20%, more than double that of whites. Overall, during the 1980s, wages and employment for black males fell farther than for any other group in the population. The 1980s are now seen as a decade ruled by misplaced values. Buying out companies generated more profits than running them, and making deals, not products, was the way to get rich. Corporate mergers produced billions in fees for lawyers, economic advisors, and stockbrokers. Wall Street financiers praised greed as healthy. Taxpayers paid for some of the consequences. The deregulation of savings and loan associations allowed these institutions to invest in risky real estate ventures and mergers. When losses pushed the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, which insured depositors' accounts, toward bankruptcy, the federal government bailed out the savings and loans institutions at a cost of $20 billion. Though supply-side advocates argued that lower taxes would increase government revenues by stimulating economic activity, federal spending on the military in particular created enormous budget deficits. The national deficit under Reagan tripled to $2.7 trillion. But Reagan remained very popular and easily defeated the Democratic candidate, Walter Mondale, in the 1984 election. Under Reagan, Congress passed the most significant reform of immigration policy since 1965. Large numbers of immigrants had entered the country from Mexico without authorization, drawn by strong demand for low-wage labor. Calls to stem the flow of undocumented immigrants grew. Reagan viewed immigration as crucial to the country's economic strength. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 provided amnesty and a path to citizenship for nearly 3 million undocumented immigrants who had put down roots in the country, but penalized employers who knowingly hired them. In some ways, Reagan disappointed conservatives. While his administration sharply reduced programs such as food stamps and school lunches, it left intact core elements of the welfare state, such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Reagan also did little for the Christian right. Abortion remained legal, women continued to enter the labor force, and Reagan appointed the first female member of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. Reagan voiced support for a constitutional amendment that would allow prayer in public schools, but the effort went nowhere. Nancy Reagan, the First Lady, launched a Just Say No campaign against illegal drug use, but it failed to stop the spread of crack, a cheap form of cocaine, in urban areas. And Reagan did little to halt affirmative action. If Reagan weakened the federal government's power to regulate business, he strengthened its role in crime control. Reagan built on initiatives begun during the Nixon administration, including increased spending on policing and law enforcement and an expansion of the nation's prisons. In 1973, Nixon declared an all-out war on the global drug menace, but with little result. Reagan expanded on Nixon's tough-on-crime approach. The Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 reinstated the federal death penalty, abolished the federal parole system, and instituted harsh sentencing guidelines for judges to implement. Public fears about the spread of crack in urban areas contributed to support for these punitive policies. Reagan brought national spending on criminal justice to a record high of nearly $3.5 billion. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act led to a surge in arrests and a rapidly expanding prison population, most of them blacks and Hispanics who were disproportionately targeted by police. But the war on drugs failed to seriously disrupt global supply chains or the domestic demand for drugs. Reagan also revived the Cold War. He vigorously denounced the Soviet Union as an evil empire and started the largest military buildup in U.S. history, including long-range bombers and missiles. In 1983, he proposed a strategic defense initiative to develop a space-based system to intercept and destroy enemy missiles. The idea was not technologically feasible and, if deployed, would have violated the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. But Reagan wanted to reassert America's world power. He pressed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization into deploying short-range nuclear weapons in Europe. The renewed armed race and Reagan's talk of winning a nuclear war spread alarm and fear around the world. In the early 1980s, a mass movement in the United States and Europe called for a nuclear freeze, an end to nuclear arms development. Reagan also wanted to end Americans' reluctance to commit U.S. forces overseas, which was the result of Vietnam. He sent troops to invade Grenada, a tiny Caribbean island, to remove a pro-Castro government. He bombed Libya to retaliate against that government's alleged involvement in a terrorist attack in West Berlin, and in 1982 he sent U.S. Marines to Lebanon to keep the peace in a civil war, but quickly withdrew them after a bomb exploded at a U.S. barracks, killing 241 Americans. But Reagan preferred to achieve his objectives through military aid, not U.S. troops. He abandoned Carter's emphasis on human rights and affirmed that the United States should support authoritarian anti-communist regimes. Under Reagan, the country became closer to anti-communist dictatorships in Chile and South Africa. His administration also sent money and arms to the governments of El Salvador and Guatemala, whose armies and associated death squads committed atrocities against civilian opponents. U.S. involvement in Central America created the great scandal of Reagan's presidency, the Iran-Contra affair. In 1984, Congress banned military aid to the Contras, those in Nicaragua fighting the Sandinistas, who in 1979 had ousted the U.S.-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza. In 1985, Reagan secretly authorized the sale of arms to Iran, then engaged in a war with Iraq, in order to get the release of American hostages held by Islamic groups in the Middle East. But the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council diverted funds from the arms sales to buy military supplies for the Contras in defiance of Congress. In 1987, the scheme was exposed in the media, and Congress held televised hearings that showed lying and violations of law that recalled the Nixon era. 11 members of Reagan's administration were convicted of perjury or destroying documents or pled guilty before they were tried. Reagan denied knowledge of the scheme, but the affair undermined the public's confidence in him. Surprisingly, Reagan, in his second term, softened his anti-communism rhetoric and established good relations with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 and wanted to reform the Soviet Union's political system, called glasnost, and reinvigorate its economy, called perestroika. The USSR had fallen far behind the US in producing and distributing consumer goods and relied more and more on food imports to feed itself. Gorbachev realized that the reforms he wanted required cuts in military costs. Reagan was ready to negotiate, and they held a series of talks on arms control that concluded with agreements to reduce nuclear weapon stockpiles. In 1988, Gorbachev started to withdraw Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Reagan, despite starting his presidency as a Cold Warrior, left office repudiating his early militant anti-Soviet stance. Reagan's presidency showed the contradictions of modern conservatism. Though he wanted to appeal to the religious right, the Reagan Revolution undermined traditional and conservative values by inspiring speculation, business mergers, and investors to pursue profits at the cost of plant closings, job losses, and devastated communities. Deindustrialization, unemployment, and downward pressure on wages all threatened local traditions and family stability and undermined a common sense of national purpose by expanding income and wealth inequality. Because of Iran-Contra and huge deficits, Reagan left office with a tarnished reputation. But few figures have so decisively reshaped American politics. Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, defeated Michael Dukakis, governor of Massachusetts, in the 1988 election, in part because Dukakis could not deny that he was a liberal, which was now a term of political abuse. Conservative ideas about the virtues of free markets and the evils of big government dominated the media and debates. Those receiving public aid were now seen not as unfortunate, but as a burden on taxpayers. The Democratic president of the 1990s, Bill Clinton, embraced many of these ideas. The 1988 election saw politics at new lows. Senator Gary Hart of Colorado, the Democratic frontrunner, dropped out of the race after a sexual affair was revealed. Both parties ran negative campaigns. At the lowest point of the campaign were Republican television ads that said Dukakis, as governor of Massachusetts, had released from jail Willie Horton, a black murderer and rapist. Bush achieved a substantial victory, winning 54% of the popular vote, but Democrats retained control of Congress. So, that's the end of Section 6. We'll be back for Chapter 27 next time.